Welcome, everyone, to the Fields of Consciousness podcast, the podcast for consciousness conversations. And I'm your host, Jeffrey Stegman.
And I am Clayten Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focus Life Force Energy, we're here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level. From your thoughts to your reality, let's explore together how consciousness interacts with our everyday experiences.
Our last episode was part 1 of relationships and manifesting in a high consciousness field. In this episode, we dive back into part 2, discussing both conscious and unconscious manifesting. Welcome to the podcast. Yeah, it's attracting or manifesting anything in life it's a really interesting topic, and we have and we'll probably talk about it towards the end here. We have a magnetizing process that we share with the public that we've refined quite a bit. And one of the things that's good to remember about manifesting is that we manifest what we think about, whether we want it or not. Mm-hmm. So having a list of things that you do want can help you manage your thoughts along those lines. And if we're wondering what thoughts we're thinking, we only have to look at our own lives, because we're manifesting all the time. And the current reality of our lives is the result of our thinking. And sometimes that's a hard thing to face.
Yeah, let's maybe we'll come back to the some more on relationships and just talk about go ahead and talk about manifesting a little more now, since you opened it up. Yeah, and there's so much out there about manifesting. I mean, there's The Secret and the Law of Attraction, the Abraham Hicks material, and what she said was really interesting. We're creating our life all the time. We're manifesting all the time. That it's really not a secret. It's just how things work. In a high consciousness field seems to really affect that, just because there's more energy and there's more power to our thoughts. So what you said, Clayten, is look at what's going on in your life, like a manifestation audit, something like that.
Yes. Yeah. We talked about, I like that term.
Mm-hmm. So take a look. What's there in your life is what you've manifested to this point.
That's what you're thinking. Doesn't mean you're necessarily aware of it, and some of it you may not like, but I think that's just the reality for all of us, is to look at the current reality we're experiencing is the cumulative result of our thinking. And of course, we can change that. Mm-hmm. Now, the good news is that in a high consciousness field, you're at the person is at a higher level of consciousness, and the good news is your thoughts are more powerful. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is that your thoughts are more powerful. Mm-hmm. So, but there is a long-term benefit, definitely, in being in a high consciousness field. You're thinking more loving thoughts. Mm-hmm. And when you're sending out love into the universe, you're getting that back. Mm-hmm. And that's a pretty safe generalization about a high field.
So we have these occasionally what we call 1,000 out of 1,000 statements. So we use kinesiology and the Dr. David Hawkins map of consciousness to sort of measure the truth of the statement. So we have this 1,000 out of 1,000 statement on this subject that I think does explain what we're talking about and why you might need a manifestation audit. Do you want to say it, Clayten? Because I thought it was really interesting. You came up with that.
Yeah, is that the shadow one?
No, it's the any thought that spends time in your beingness is becoming manifest in your life.
Yeah.
whether that thought is yours or not.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
So your beingness, I mean, that includes your unconscious too, right? I mean, it's
body, mind, spirit. We've been talking a lot about how the news lately, I don't know if it's the news is more powerful or the topics in the news are more dramatic. It just seems like when I listen to the news, it just really affects me more than I recall in the past. And if you're listening to news, and most of the news isn't about the great things that are happening in life. Most of it's about the problems.
Yeah.
And so, that's in your beingness. However you define beingness, we tend to think of it as body, mind, spirit. But you can't listen to the news a lot and being in that negative confirmation of, there is some negativity out there for sure. And but there seems to be an accumulation of all the bad things that happen in the world that gets repeated over and over and over again. And there's not a lot of talk in at least most of the news about the good things that are happening every day. And so if you're in that negative energetic field, then what's it doing to our beingness? And I think a lot of us are probably naive about the absolute negative effect that it has. Yeah, maybe me too, because I don't listen to a lot of news, but man, when I do, it's just, just seems to exhaust me.
Yeah, and I think we were saying in previous podcasts and other times about the power of like a live broadcast, like really watching people talk and other people are watching at the same time. And it must go into your beingness, in a different kind of way that's more powerful. I mean,
there's a type of, I think the word we used was entrainment, Jeff. We get entrained with other people. In a high consciousness field, you're entrained positively. And if it's a low consciousness field, and a lot of the news is fear-based or anger-based, you're entrained with all those other people. Yeah. And I know that if I'm listening to the news and I stop and I do some kinesiology, typically my acupressure system seems to be, or my meridians seem to be out of alignment. That's one of the consistent things that I'm seeing. And I don't listen to a lot of news. Maybe if I do 30 minutes a week, that's a lot now. It just used to be a habit. Just go downstairs to make a cup of tea or something, and you turn the news on and just catch up what's going on. And I don't know. I don't know if I need to know about all those negative things.
Yeah, I'll just read this again because it's these 1,000 out of 1,000 are really high truths. So any thought that spends time in your beingness is becoming manifest in your life, whether that thought is yours or not. And it's sort of blowing my mind here that thoughts that aren't my thoughts are manifesting in my life. Whether it's from the news, like we've said, or we've talked about in previous podcasts, thought forms in different fields of consciousness, whether it's like large social complexes or, like a small regional thought form from the past, that it's becoming manifest in my life. If that thought is spending time in my beingness, it's a really good reason to really pay attention to our thoughts. And as we said, in a high consciousness field, they have more power, and just shift it, move to a different thought, move to a positive declarative statement about what we want to see in our life.
To pay attention to our environments just as much, because it's, in that it's in our beingness, whether we're thinking it or not. And we have a lot of control and, and the responsibility that goes with that to manage our own thinking. And we have talked in the past about environment being more important than personal will. Negative environments just wear you down. And there is a saying in the personal development community, a pretty common one. It says you're going to be most like the 5 people you hang around. And I think that speaks to the environmental aspect, as well as people are on the same wavelength, yeah, when you get those 1,000 statements, there's so much depth to them. There's, I don't know if we can do it justice here, just because we could talk about it for an hour and probably not even scratch the surface.
Yeah. So in this thought, spending time in our beingness, our thoughts have power, and that we're saying it's becoming manifest in our lives. And what we hear from customers and what we've been experiencing is manifesting in a high consciousness environment. As we've said, there's more power. There's more power to the thoughts as we rise in consciousness, or if we do rise in consciousness. And as we create these fields or we invoke a higher power, that our thoughts then do have much more power. And so what people have seen and is like a quicker manifesting, like things happen more quickly. And the synchronicities, which seem to be sort of universal signs pointing us along the way, seem to happen more with greater awareness. I don't know if they're happening more frequently or we're just more aware of them. And we've had customers say that things happen so fast that they're really surprised, and it has helped them to watch their minds because it happens the other direction as well. So,
yeah, well, the average customer goes up 30 points in consciousness in 90 days if they're in the FLFE environment 24/7. I think it's 10 points if they're in the environment 8 hours a day. I can't remember, but that's it's every point on that logarithmic scale, which is the Hawkins map of consciousness, is 10 times more power. And it's 10 times more power to create the life that you want, as you often say. And so things start happening quicker. Absolutely. Because it's partly in the environment and it's partially their own individual consciousness that's changing that dynamic.
Yeah, we've been doing this process in the morning meetings now where we declare a vision for the future and to picture ourselves in the vision, sort of looking from a third party perspective, like seeing ourselves in the situation. Often it'll be, something about the growth of FLFE or something in evidence or new referral partners or, new customers coming in to the family, and holding that vision of that occurring and the feeling of it, and kind of seeing ourselves celebrating, doing the happy dance, whatever's happening. And then clearing obstacles on the way to get there. So that's been a new practice for us. It's been really powerful.
Yeah, I don't come on as many of the morning meetings as I used to, but when I have come on, it's really a sweet way to start the day. It feels like there's like the road is laid out ahead, it's a great way to start the day.
Yeah. So spending time in those positive declarations and conscious creation of what it is we want, and noticing when we're in a negative self-talk. I said I would tell a story about myself. I'll do that. Yeah, one of the things that I have is a really large to-do list, and it keeps getting longer. And we often work with coaches and people to help us see those unconscious patterns that we have. And sometimes they appear easily, and sometimes it takes a little digging to get to those. And I have a story around that I'm not worthy without a big to-do list. And so that sort of unconscious story is playing in the background. And so then, looking for what's the new story, and moving consciously into the new story to get that list down to a very small list. So that's just something I wanted to share, that sometimes it's unconscious and it takes a while to bring it to full awareness, and that audit idea we talked about, where you're looking at your life and seeing where, what's not working that well. And so when I look at my life and I look at what's not working that well, I've got this stack of paper over here. It's like, inches thick of to-dos to do. And that's a part that's not working well. So the audit is a great idea to help point us towards what are the patterns, what are the beliefs, what are the unconscious beliefs that we might have around that. And move to a positive declaration instead.
Yeah, absolutely. The current reality in our life reveals the patterns in our thinking. And we both have piles. And so we might have a different story behind our piles, but there is no doubt a story that isn't the story of freedom and relaxed living and and the ultimate expression of abundance. Mm-hmm. And whatever is underneath that, it can take some digging for sure. Mm-hmm. And we know when we've got to the bottom and cleared it is when the pile goes away, right? So there may be, as they say, a few layers to the onion on that one for both of us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, I'd love to get back to the magnetizing process because that's really interesting and useful. But I don't want to skip over this. Something we talked about earlier in relationships, and we were talking about kirtan and musical events, concerts that we go to. But there's a phenomenon there that we haven't talked about yet, mm-hmm. about kind of the one-to-many. That performers, like you did some study. It was Celine Dion, and you were looking at her when she's in a concert. Can you talk about that? It was fascinating to me, Clayten.
Yeah, well, I was Celine Dion's a pretty well-known performer. She happens to be Canadian. I think she's from Quebec. And people talked about the experience they had at a concert that seemed to be a transcendent experience. Mm-hmm. And I haven't been to a lot of different types of concerts to know the distinction between a certain type of performer. Like if you're at I think the term death metal is pretty self-evident that it's going to be about the anger that song was written in, and certainly, the blues and singing the blues, that's just part of life. And Celine Dion tends to have, a lot of songs about songs are stories about life, but for whatever reason, I mean, she's a pretty high consciousness person. I don't know what you would call her enlightened in the classical term, but if we're using the Hawkins map of consciousness, we would say that she's in the 500s for sure in her life. I mean, she's got a great career and she contributes to a lot of people, and she's in the 500s. So I was trying to figure out what this phenomena was with her. And so I started testing her level of consciousness and the level of consciousness of the audience when she performed. And what happened during the performance was that within 15 minutes, she would be at 550. And then within 30 minutes, she would go up to 600. And then at some point in the evening, and this happens with a lot of healers, actually, a lot of body workers, a lot of therapists, when they're really in the zone, they go to 700. Mm. And she does that in her performances. Now, I'm not saying she lives there all the time, but she is there for part of the performances that I've analyzed. Mm. And there is this phenomena where when a performer is in a high consciousness field and they're the biggest influence of the energy in the audience, it's that positive attunement again, Jeff, and she creates a field, a high consciousness field. And, you don't want to analyze everything down to a technical term. We just would think of it as a great experience. And if you sort of go into the measurement aspect of it from kinesiology using the Hawkins map of consciousness, you'll find that the audience actually gets lifted up during the performance, and it tends to follow her ascension up the map of consciousness. Mm-hmm. As she goes higher and higher throughout the evening, then the audience follows along. And mm-hmm. from what I can tell, that's the phenomena. So mm-hmm. the audience at some point will experience as a whole, now it doesn't mean everybody will, but as a whole, the audience will go to 600 during one of her performances. And that is that's peace on the Hawkins map of consciousness, the beginning of enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And from what I can tell, that's the phenomena that people talk about mm-hmm. when they're in they're in that field with her.
Yeah, they're in a high consciousness field.
Yeah.
And so they're enjoying that concert and that, that experience. And it's pretty rare to spend a lot of time in that. It's like you said, we've been talking about generating high conscious fields and how you do it and what experience you have. But it's really interesting that entrainment, so you have the singer, and you have the band, and, mm-hmm. what it's like there in the venue. And I've experienced that as well, like in Kirtan with the chanting and Audrey's chanting, in that there's something in the resonance of the voice that's carrying that consciousness to the listeners. It reminds me, and we talked about this before the podcast, that it reminds me of the EMF mitigation that we do in the FLFE and service with a cell phone, where the cell phone itself is high raised in consciousness until the antenna is vibrating at this higher consciousness rate and somehow affecting the emissions. And when we first started working with this creating high conscious field around an object or around like a phone, we noticed that people were noticing that when they listened to music through the phone, it had a much greater effect on them. I think there is some kind of like transmission of the field through sound. So performers, and maybe it's conscious, maybe it's not. They're just naturally moving into those states. Go ahead.
Someone who I would assume that would have a very deliberate process around that would be the Dalai Lama. You were just going to mention him. A few of us have seen him speak, probably, that are listening to this. I've seen him speak in Vancouver at the Pacific National Exhibition Building, where we have our big annual fair there when I lived in Vancouver. And they had, a bunch of monks going in and praying in the environment before his lecture started. And there was a palpable energy in the auditorium. No doubt about it. And, monks, that's a lot of their focus in their life is consciousness. So I would assume that, their conversation around what they were doing would be a little more measured and using the language of consciousness rather than, whereas a performer would be probably talking about the experience perhaps and not using the consciousness language. It's like, well, we want to use this lighting and this sound, and we want to have the songs in this order, and things are going to build up to a certain point, and then maybe, they have a song that will take people through a story and an experience. I don't know how people plan those events, but they're pretty sophisticated. So I'm assuming that they would have a real story for the evening. And the Dalai Lama was an impressive energetic field. I mean, I've experienced that personally.
And one of the things I've heard about, and coming from musicians personally through Audrey and others, but you hear about it a lot, is that the feedback loop that happens.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So the performer's going up, they're activating a field, they're transmitting that, and then the audience is coming up and they're transmitting back, whether, it might be through the applause and cheering and whatever else they're doing. But there's also a field effect, a field of consciousness effect that seems to happen that sort of boosts. It's like a upward spiral of consciousness that seems to happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've heard from, I had a good friend for many years. He was a musician growing up. And we were both in this philosophical organization. And, you're talking about consciousness and having these experiences at lectures or during ceremonies and different things like that. And he said the highest he's ever felt in his life was when he was on stage and people were basically sending him all this love. That's how he described it. Mm-hmm. And so that feedback loop, there's something to that. You have all these people are showing up because they like the entertainer, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, most of them, maybe some new people or people are just going with friends, but they're bringing a lot of goodwill.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've been talking about relationship with others, and this musician audience one is really kind of an interesting one to many, but our relationships with ourselves. And I would think it would be something for musicians, really popular ones who get in that feedback loop that, could really bring up some shadow pieces, some ego pieces as well. And could be difficult to work with. But you had a great working definition of shadow, because some people may not be familiar with that term, what we mean by that. It's part of this relationship with ourselves.
Yeah, we were trying to get a 1,000 out of 1,000 definition of shadow, and we think we got it to 980, but it's pretty close. And there can be more than one definition of shadow. That's 1,000, but the one that we're working with is becoming aware of and transcending, ideally through a loving integration, aspects of ourselves that we don't feel good about. And shadow is, when we're working with shadow, it's talking about those things we feel shame about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's kind of back to the audit, function. It's like, looking at where is it that we get triggered into shame, or we feel shame about something, or we don't feel good about ourselves in some way, that there's some underlying beliefs or unconscious patterns for us to look at, and becoming aware of those and transcending those is shadow work. So in a high consciousness field, how does that affect this type of work? Or natural process? I guess it happens naturally too, doesn't it?
I'm not sure if it happens naturally. I'd have to think about that. But in a high consciousness field, I would say there's less shadow in many ways, because you're in a higher state. And when you're in a state of, high amount of light, if we use that metaphor, sometimes it's easier to see the darkness because there's so much kind of purity to it. That's the word that's coming to mind for me. That, and I'm trying not to make purity good and impurity bad. It's just that if you have a white shirt, it's pretty easy to see a stain. If you have a black shirt, kind of covers stuff up. So shadow work there's more and more, I think, being done with that in the world. I think, is it Brene Brown? She's coming to mind. There's a couple other people that I can't think of right now. And it's that work tends to be done best in a one-on-one environment with a professional in many cases. I know there's a tendency in the world to want to, in certain types of workshops and belief systems, they'll get into deep aspects of shadow in a group setting. And I don't know that that's the best way to manage it. I mean, there's certain things you can talk about in public that's not probably too vulnerable. You just have to know yourself and how to manage that when you're in a big group, hundreds of people. I'd want to be pretty cautious about how much I would share, just because not everybody's able to hold that. They're not able to hold space for someone to heal as well as a trained professional.
Mm-hmm.
But, just different people think different ways about it. But definitely in a high consciousness field, there's a greater awareness of the things that are in the way of you experiencing the joy that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Contrast.
Yep. And surfacing those things to work on. Yeah.
But and the good news is, in a high field, there's more capacity to stay out of the overwhelm that shadow less typically brings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's less negative charge. So you can identify something. And oftentimes, if you're doing personal work, you identify something, you go in, you do the work, you come out, and you're able to, and you keep your life moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, not everybody may say it that way, but that's one way to look at doing shadow work.
Mm-hmm.
Is to consciously go in with the support that you need. If you can do it yourself, great. And then come out of that, and your life's going to go to the next level of joy.
Mm-hmm.
Those piles are going to get a little shorter.
Yeah. I'm hoping. Well, I guess that managing that change, right? Because we're always adapting and changing, but in this case, you might be getting at some really deep things that may be part of, in this case, my self-worth. Where we're at deep-seated sort of belief that isn't serving anymore, but it's still there. And so, in surfacing and transcending, there's some kind of the management of the process and taking care of yourself, in that there's, rest and, eating well, drinking plenty of water, maybe taking some of the supplements that we've identified that help with moving up in consciousness, the essential fatty acids and magnesiums, which we'll get to sometime in another podcast. But really how do we manage that integration? How do you do that, Clayten? Is there anything in particular you could share about that?
Yeah, classically, self-care is a big topic in that community or in that conversation. Mm-hmm. You're managing the shadow. I think having a conscious, deliberate process to go in and do the work on a regular basis, not just when you're in an emergency. And that's like that bank account idea between people, Jeff, that you have goodwill built up. So if you're doing individual work, I would say having a regular schedule with a process that you know that works for you. And that's part of understanding yourself and knowing how to manage the process of change, because we're in a constant state of change. So that's the personal development piece, is knowing what it is you want to work on. You typically look for what we call the critical factor, where you can get the most amount of gain for the least amount of effort. So that's helpful as a framework. And there's also, group shadow. Like when we talk about how to create a high consciousness field in a group, if you're doing, like, we use a coach in the company. And what I like about that is that when there's a group of us doing that work, and you don't have to really say things that are too personal to do shadow work, you can talk about that pile of paper and how you're experiencing frustration with it, and you can do an energetic release technique in your body, and no one else has to know why you think that pile is there. And when we do that work in a group, it's one of the founding principles of creating a high consciousness field in a group, is that I'm not aware of any group that can maintain the field at a certain level, at a very high level, without doing group work. And the same with a person individually. If a lot of people can create great things, but they end up self-destructing or not being able to maintain them. And that's just because they have work to do. A lot a lot of people that are, kind of celebrity types, they just have a lot more attention on their lives than most of us. So we tend to see their lives, it's easier to identify the pattern when someone's so much in the public eye, their lives are under scrutiny. But, all of us have struggled, I think, with creating something in our life that's good and then having it go away and wondering why. Or we're not being able to create something. Like, why can these people have a great career? I've got the same education, I went to the same school, and, and I can't, and I'm, I can't hold down a job, or they're running the company and I've been there longer than them. And I feel like I work as hard, but I'm not getting the same results. And, those are things to look at. It's like, what's in the way, if that's what you want.
Yeah. We'll go back and talking about shadow in the company. It's really been interesting for me to work in a group because I've been used to one-on-one work with, I always have a coach, and, I did a lot of work with you, Clayten, when you were actually doing active coaching and continuing, but keep bringing it into a company and with the management team where we're surfacing those things that, are coming up for us that, it's like that audit, like, what's up for me? What doesn't feel good, or what am I got to charge on, something I've got to charge on. And it does help surface some of those white elephants, things that we need to talk about and get out. I think it is part of running a company, as a spiritual path, that maybe it's a spiritual practice is doing this. It's part of the whole picture in clearing those things up so that we can create a high field together, so that we can, uncover the truth and, do whatever we do as a business. So I think that's really a fascinating, we'll get into business as a spiritual path at some point, I'm sure, in another podcast.
Yeah, I just thought it was worth mentioning that I'm not aware of people creating anything great individually or as a group. There's the odd person that's just born pretty high and they have a really good family, and they can just go about their lives and just create great things and enjoy it. Most of us have to do work to create great things and keep them. And that applies to an individual as well as a business. And I'm really glad to be working in a business where we're doing that work proactively. Sometimes, we're dealing with an issue, and most of the time now it's proactive. And the goodwill that we create carries us through those really hard times. And sooner or later, we all have them, right? It just seems to be the nature of living. And sometimes it's not even a bad thing that's happened. Somebody's passing it may be the best thing for them, maybe their time, but it just brings up a lot of things in us when they pass over, or some phase of life, or something happens with a family member. It's not necessarily what happens in the world, it's our reaction to it. And it's a really interesting topic about how to create something in a group that you can sustain.
It's like the high consciousness field helps you to do the work, which then leads to a higher field together. It's like a positive upward spiral.
Yeah.
It seems that positive upward spirals are, a part of how things work, like this positive feedback loop that we see with performers, and we see this, doing this kind of work together in a group, creating a high field together. So we have this tool, Magnetizing. It's on the FLFE website, flfe.net, in the tools section. So if you're interested, you could take a look. So we developed that. It's been some time. We, got it pretty high. It's meant to be a process for manifesting in a high consciousness environment. I think it came out of some of your early work, Clayten. the magnetizing process.
Yeah, what's interesting about using kinesiology is you can measure the level of consciousness of your assumptions or your perceptions, and you can measure the level of consciousness of other people's perceptions. And it takes, it can take years to get good at it. And once you get good at it, it's pretty revealing. One of the big things in personal development work and trying to raise your consciousness is what is the truth and what is the belief system. Oftentimes you'll have a very high consciousness person, perhaps someone who was a founder of a religion or a spiritual teaching, and they're extremely high in one part of their life and they're not so high in another. And we take all the things they say as a package deal because they're so extraordinarily high in this part of their life. And, people who have started religions, I would think for the most part, their intentions are really good and they just only know what they know. They're like everybody else. They just happen to be extremely well aligned in some areas. So the possibility with kinesiology and what excited me about it so much is that I could look at, well, what's the level of consciousness of that statement? And the statement could be true at let's say a 400 out of 1,000 on the Hawkins map of consciousness. And then another statement could, on that same topic, could be 600 out of 1,000. And another could be 750 out of 1,000. And then you can look at the differences between those statements and look for the distinctions in concept that are that are supporting or behind the statements. And so when we looked at manifesting, we looked at, standard manifestation techniques and started writing out what we thought was true, and then putting this belief system in, and then see if the whole thing went up in consciousness. And, sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. And there was this thing where we didn't know at some point if it was a belief system or if it was a truth, or if it was a higher truth than what we had on paper. So that was the process of doing the manifestation technique. And it was, a fair bit of work. Like we used, principles from The Secret. Abraham Hicks has really quite high material. I think it's about 800, most of the Abraham Hicks teachings. I can't remember all the authors, but, we've been around this industry for, I started working professionally as a coach back in 1995. So it's 2021 now, and I haven't done much for the last year or so, but pretty well 25 years doing that. And you come across a lot of different manifesting perceptions, and I don't think we missed any major body of work in that. And if I recall, we got the technique up to 998 out of 1,000, and we could never figure out how to get it to 1,000 out of 1,000, the whole technique.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, we go back and once in a while and check things, and it's, you don't know what you don't know. But 998, that's pretty high.
So that's a powerful tool. I recommend you take a look at it. And what we'd like to do in these talks is give you some things that you can try at home. And in this, we've talked a lot about manifesting and, what it's like in a high consciousness field. And, what you could do if you like is to look to manifest to change yourself, in yourself or in your world. So you want to talk a little bit more about that, Clayten? I guess a positive affirmation, or, if you go to our magnetizing process, you might get some ideas about how to do that.
Yeah, one of the things about the coaching process, and we haven't talked about this yet before, Jeff. I wouldn't consider this necessarily a coaching venue, but what I did learn in coaching was that if you take one action as a result of the session that you wouldn't have taken if we hadn't met, that helps you integrate what was shared and what was learned.
Mm.
And so this is the same principle that we're wanting to share with all of you listening. It's an opportunity for you to take something that you've heard today that you find interesting, or something that we've said that's triggered a thought within you, and you would like to explore where that can take you in creating the life you want. If you take an action on the concept you've heard or the ideas that were stimulated within you, then you're much more likely to have a positive result in your life than if you just listen to it and don't do anything. And you may be doing more than enough in your life. So I'm not saying that, and we're not saying that you need to do more. And there is a principle involved that if you take action on something that you've heard that you think will increase the quality of your life, that it's more likely to increase the quality of your life. That's just pretty straightforward. So the opportunity this week, Jeff, we talked about choosing or asking people to choose something in your life that you want to change. And positive affirmations are a well-known technique in the personal development field or the consciousness raising field. And they're typically a positive declarative statement. And do you have any that come to mind, Jeff? I know we talked about sleep and a few things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would. I'm going to work on the pile. So yeah, for me personally, I like to see it. Maybe I'm a more visual person,
Mm-hmm.
so I would see the change, already happened. So I would, in this case, got an empty desk to my left or one piece of paper with a few things on it, and just see that, and to just know to see myself seeing that,
Mm-hmm.
kind of have that vision of it. And that's what's in our magnetizing process. And that works well for me. But the positive affirmation or statements might come up for me later in the day, when I'm not thinking about it, but I catch myself thinking about the list. That's maybe when I would make a declaration that, I just have one piece of paper and it just has a few items on it, that my list doesn't define me as my worth, might be something around that, getting down into the what's behind it. So that's where the statement might come in for me, but I tend to use the visual image of it already complete.
Yeah, the one that's coming to mind for me is I have a lot of resistance hitting the gym. And I've got an appointment to be there, so I'm going to show up. But there's a lot more story involved in getting there than I'd like to have. And if I can get myself there, I know I'm fine. So I think that what I'm going to play with is I know I'll feel better when I'm leaving. Sometimes that's what I'm going to play with. And then it's like, yeah, I know I feel better when I'm, not even when I'm there, because it takes me a little while to, get into it. But by the end, it's like, yeah, this was great. I'm glad I came. So that'll be mine. Something to that effect. I know I'll feel better when I'm leaving. And then it's like, yeah, I will. I know I always do. So I think that's what I'm going to play with.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
We'll check in later together about these two.
Yes. I'll work on my pile next week. Thank you for joining Fields of Consciousness, the podcast of consciousness conversations. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a completely free trial of Focused Life Force Energy for 15 days.
And if you like, you can subscribe to the Fields of Consciousness podcast and tune in next time. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11:11 a.m. PST. Onward and upward.